My name is Natalie Brooks, and I am 33 years old. I live in a secluded private community tucked against the mountains outside Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the houses sit far apart on wide lots, and everyone knows everyone else's business without ever saying it out loud. For years, I kept telling myself the same quiet story my mother handled the family money, because she was better at it. My sister Courtney stayed close, because that was just how our family worked, and the small, steady ways they steered decisions around me were probably for the best. I was methodical by nature. I liked numbers and documents and clear steps. I told myself that made me difficult sometimes, not that anything was actually wrong. If you have ever felt the ground shift under a conversation you thought was simple, stay with me for a minute. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning in early spring when the hospital called about my father. Paul had been slowing down for months, but none of us said the word serious out loud until that call. I was at my desk in the medical records wing of the regional hospital that served our community and the surrounding ranches. I worked as a patient advocate and records coordinator, the kind of job that let me stay close to facts without having to perform for anyone. Thomas Nguyen, the hospital's legal liaison, had become someone I could trust with the complicated cases. He was calm, precise, and never rushed me when I asked for clarification on forms. I drove straight to the hospital after my shift. The private community where we lived was only 20 minutes away, but the drive felt longer that day because my mind kept circling the same question. Why had my mother sounded almost relieved when she told me over the phone that everything was being handled? I parked in the visitor lot and walked through the automatic doors into the familiar smell of antiseptic and coffee. My mother and my sister were already in the small conference room off the cardiac unit. They had papers spread across the table. My mother looked up first. She wore the same careful expression she always used when she wanted everyone to stay calm. "Natalie, good you're here. We need your signature on a few things so we can move forward with your father's care without delays." Her voice was smooth, the same tone she used at community association meetings when she wanted a decision to land exactly where she wanted it. My sister Courtney sat beside her, scrolling on her phone like this was just another errand. She glanced up and gave me a quick, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dad's resting. Mom and I have been here since this morning. The doctors say the paperwork needs to be consistent." I sat down across from them. Thomas Nguyen appeared in the doorway a moment later, a thin folder in his hand. He nodded at me in that quiet way he had when something needed a second look. "Mrs. Brooks, if we could go over the insurance authorizations and the updated consent forms first," he said. His eyes flicked to mine for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. My mother waved a hand. "We already reviewed them. Natalie can sign where the tabs are. We don't want to keep the doctors waiting." Thomas opened the folder anyway and slid 2 pages toward me. One was a standard insurance consent. The other was an older document, a copy of a trust disbursement request from 2 years earlier. The name on the trust was my grandmother's. I remembered the conversations years ago when she was still alive, the careful way she had said she wanted a portion set aside specifically so I could start my own consulting work if I ever chose to leave the hospital job. It had never been a huge amount, but it had been mine on paper. I had seen the original documents once filed neatly in my mother's home office. The number on the page in front of me was smaller than I remembered, significantly smaller. I looked at Thomas. He kept his voice low. "There are a few discrepancies in the accounting trail for that trust. The hospital billing department flagged it when we pulled records for your father's current coverage. I thought you should see it before anything else gets signed today." My mother's hand moved fast, covering the page. "Thomas, this is not the time. My husband is upstairs, and we are trying to keep things simple for the family." She turned to me, and the warmth in her voice dropped just enough that only I would hear the edge. "Natalie, you have always been the one who needs every line explained twice. Your father is sick. We are trying to protect what little stability we have left. Signing these forms is not a debate." My sister set her phone down. "Mom's right. You turning everything into a spreadsheet right now isn't helping anyone. Dad wouldn't want us fighting over old paperwork while he's upstairs." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that always came when they both spoke at once like this. It was not loud. It was never loud. It was the slow, steady pressure of being told that my questions were the problem, not the numbers that didn't add up. I had felt versions of it for years, the times my mother had handled investment statements, without showing me the times my sister had borrowed against family accounts and called it temporary, the way any mention of the money my grandmother had set aside for me was met with. We all needed help at different times. Thomas cleared his throat gently. I can step out if the family needs a moment. I shook my head. No, I want to understand what I'm signing. My voice came out steadier than I felt, methodical. That was the word my mother used when she wanted to make my caution sound like a flaw. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me the way she looked at people in the community when they questioned one of her proposals. You've always been suspicious of the way this family takes care of its own. That is not loyalty, Natalie. That is just making everything harder than it needs to be. My sister nodded once like the point had been made. Exactly. We are all here for Dad. If you need to read every page twice, fine, but do it quickly. The doctors are waiting on these. I signed nothing that afternoon. I asked Thomas to make copies of the pages he had shown me, and I took them with me when I left. My mother did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The disappointment in her face was enough to make the hallway feel narrower on my way out. When I got home, Kevin was already there. He worked remotely for a real estate investment group that had strong ties in the valley. The community here was small enough that reputations traveled fast between the big houses and the association meetings. He listened while I told him what I had seen, the reduced number on the trust page, the way my mother had covered it. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was trying to keep peace. Nat, I get why that looks off, but your dad is sick. If your mom and Courtney are handling the medical side, maybe just let them manage the paperwork for now. We live here. People talk when families start pulling at threads in public. Your mom has always been the one who keeps everything running smoothly for everyone. I sat at the kitchen island with the copied pages in front of me. The numbers still did not match what I remembered. My grandmother had been clear. The money was meant to give me options not to disappear into family expenses that were never explained. I had let it go before, because questioning it always led to the same conversation. I was making things difficult. I was not seeing the bigger picture. I was not being loyal. That night, I could not sleep. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and started pulling together the old statements I had saved over the years. I was not dramatic about it. I was methodical. I made a timeline. I noted every transfer date and every explanation my mother had given at the time. The pattern was quiet but consistent. Small amounts moved first, always framed as temporary needs, then larger ones, always with the same reassurance that it was for the family and that I would understand later. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I just sat there with the papers and the quiet realization that the story I had been telling myself about my family for 33 years was missing entire chapters. My husband came downstairs around 2 a.m. and saw me still at the table. "Nat," he said softly, "you sure you want to go digging right now? Your mom already thinks you are looking for problems. If this gets out in the community, it could make things messy for all of us. Your dad's name still means something here. People respect the Brooks family." I looked at him across the island. For the first time, I heard the careful distance in his voice, the way he was already calculating the cost of me asking questions out loud. The cold reality settled in my chest like a stone I had been carrying without naming it. I closed the laptop, but I did not put the papers away. My name is Natalie Brooks, and I am 33 years old. I live in a secluded private community tucked against the mountains outside Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I closed the laptop, but I did not put the papers away. I left them on the kitchen island where the early light would hit them in the morning, like evidence I was not ready to hide again. My husband went back upstairs without another word, and I sat there until the house felt too quiet. The cold reality of what I had seen at the hospital kept circling. The numbers on my grandmother's trust were smaller than they should have been, and my mother had covered the page like it was something shameful to see. The next morning, I called Thomas Nguyen before I left for work. I asked if we could meet privately away from the conference room where my mother and sister had been. He agreed without asking too many questions. When I arrived at the hospital on my lunch break, he was waiting in a small records office on the lower level, the kind of room with no windows and thick doors that kept conversations from traveling. He had pulled more files. "Natalie, I need to be careful here," he said, keeping his voice low. "These are internal records, but the discrepancies go beyond one trust. There are insurance claims from 3 years ago that list medical procedures for your father that never appear in his actual treatment history. The billing codes were for expensive diagnostics and therapies that the hospital has no record of performing. The money from those claims was routed through the same trust account your grandmother set up for you." He slid a printout across the table. The dates lined up with transfers I had noted on my own timeline the night before. My mother had signed as the responsible party on every one. Thomas did not speculate out loud, but the implication sat between us like another document I could not unsee. The family name that carried weight in our private community, the one my mother had spent years polishing at association meetings and charity events, had been built in part on claims that did not match reality. I asked him about security footage. The hospital had cameras in the main corridors and the cafeteria. Thomas hesitated, then nodded once. "There's a clip from the day one of the larger transfers happened. Your mother and your sister met with Marcus Hale, the attorney who handles most of the Brooks family paperwork in the far corner of the cafeteria. They were there for almost an hour. The footage shows them passing documents back and forth. I can't give you a copy, but I can let you watch it here if you need to see it for yourself." I watched the clip on his secure terminal. The angle was not perfect, but it was clear enough. My mother sat with her usual composed posture, leaning in when she spoke. My sister nodded along occasionally, glancing around the room like she was checking who might notice. Marcus Hale, a man I had met only once at a community event, took notes and slid a folder across the table at one point. The three of them looked like people conducting ordinary business, except the ordinary business appeared to involve moving money that had been promised to me under the table of medical necessity that never existed. When the clip ended, I felt something shift inside me, quiet but permanent. The small violations I had brushed aside for years, my mother's vague explanations about family, needs my sister's casual assumption that any extra money was community property, the way questions about the trust were always met with reminders that I was being difficult, were not isolated moments. They were a pattern that had a paper trail and now a visual record. I thanked Thomas and left the hospital without going upstairs to see my father. I needed time to think before I faced any of them again. On the drive home, I called the one person outside the family I still trusted with the practical side of my life. Marcus Hale's office answered on the second ring. I asked to speak with him directly about my grandmother's trust. The receptionist put me on hold, then came back with a message that Mr. Hale would call me back personally. He did 20 minutes later while I was still in the car. His voice was professional and cool. "Natalie, I understand you have questions about the trust distributions. Your mother has already instructed me that all estate and trust matters are to go through her while your father is receiving care. I strongly advise against pursuing independent inquiries at this time. It could complicate the medical decision-making process and create unnecessary legal exposure for everyone involved, including you. I would hate to see family disagreements turn into something that requires formal action." The threat was wrapped in concern, but it was there. Legal exposure. Formal action. I thanked him for his time and ended the call. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my chest felt tight in a new way. They were already closing ranks, and they were using my father's illness as the reason. When I got home that evening, my husband was waiting in the kitchen. He had seen the papers still on the island. Nat Marcus Hale's office just called the house line looking for you. He said you contacted him directly about trust matters. Your mom also called. She said you left the hospital without signing anything and that you were asking the staff for records you had no right to see. She sounded worried. She said if you keep pushing while your dad is this sick, it could affect how the doctors handle his care. People in the community are already starting to notice the tension. I set my bag down and looked at him. Kevin, the numbers don't match. There are insurance claims that were paid out for treatments that never happened. The trust my grandmother left for me has been drained under those claims. I watched security footage of my mother and my sister meeting with Marcus Hale to move the money. This is not me being difficult. This is documented. He rubbed his face with both hands. I believe you saw something that looks wrong. But your mom has always managed the family money. Maybe there are explanations we don't have yet. If you go public with this, or even keep digging through hospital files, it is going to spill into the association meetings and the investment circles I work with. The Brooks name still opens doors here. If that name gets dragged through rumors while your dad is dying, it could hurt more than just your relationship with your mom and Courtney. It could hurt us. The words landed with the same quiet weight my mother's disappointment always carried. My husband was not yelling. He was calculating the cost of my questions in the small, wealthy world we lived in. I felt the first real fracture in the one place I had thought was solid. Over the next week, the pressure built in small, repeated ways. My mother called every day with updates on my father that always circled back to the same request sign. The forms "Stop asking the hospital staff for extra records. Remember that family comes first when someone is sick." My sister sent a long text that read like a lecture, telling me I was making my father's final months about my own suspicions instead of supporting him. Marcus Hale left another voicemail reminding me that continued interference could trigger a formal review of my access to medical records. My husband started coming home later, saying he had meetings that ran long, and when he was home, he changed the subject whenever I mentioned the files. I kept documenting. I was methodical about it. I created a secure folder on my laptop with every statement, every transfer date, every discrepancy. Thomas had shown me, and notes from the security footage. I did not cry in front of anyone. I did not raise my voice. But every night, the weight of what I was carrying grew heavier because the evidence was clear and the people closest to me were asking me to look away from it. On the 8th day after I saw the footage, my father's condition worsened. The hospital called in the middle of the night. I drove there alone because my husband said he had an early call with a client and would meet me later. When I arrived, my mother and my sister were already in the waiting area outside the ICU. My mother stood up when she saw me. "Natalie, you need to sign the updated consent forms tonight. The doctors want to try a more aggressive approach, and they need family agreement on record. This is not the time for you to keep second-guessing every decision." My sister crossed her arms. "Dad is stable for now, but barely. If you walk in there and start demanding more explanations about old paperwork, you are going to upset him. He doesn't need to hear that his daughter thinks the family has been stealing from her while he is fighting to stay alive." I looked at both of them. The fluorescent lights made their faces look sharper than usual. I felt the old pull the one that had kept me quiet for years, the fear that I was the problem, that my need for clarity was selfish, when someone I loved was suffering. But the papers in my bag and the footage in my memory would not let the pull win completely. "I will sign what is medically necessary for his care tonight," I said. My voice was calm, the same tone I used at work when I had to deliver difficult information. "But I am not signing anything that touches the trust or the estate until I have independent legal advice. And I am not pretending the discrepancies do not exist." My mother's expression hardened in a way I had only seen once or twice before, when someone at a community meeting challenged one of her proposals too directly. "You are choosing this moment to draw a line. After everything this family has done for you, after the way we have carried you through every stage of your life, this is not strength, Natalie. This is cruelty." My sister nodded, her eyes wet but her voice steady. "You are going to regret this. When Dad is gone and you have turned what should have been a private family matter into something the whole valley is whispering about, you are going to wish you had just signed the papers and let us handle it." I signed the medical consent forms in the presence of a nurse and Thomas Nguyen, who had been called down because the legal liaison was required for any changes in care directives. I did not sign anything else. When I left the hospital at dawn, my husband was not there. He had texted that he would come by later after he handled some work. I drove back to the house in the private community as the sun came up over the mountains. The streets were empty. The big houses sat behind their gates and trees quiet and respectable. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a long time before I went inside. The evidence was in my bag. The threats were in my phone. My father was fighting for his life upstairs in a hospital room, and the people who shared his name were more concerned with protecting the story they had built around that name than with the truth sitting in the records. I knew what I had to do next. I also knew that doing it would cost me more than I had ever let myself calculate. The cold reality was no longer just about the money or the lies. It was about how much of myself I had been willing to set aside to keep the peace in a family that had never offered me the same protection in return. My name is Natalie Brooks, and I am 33 years old. I live in a secluded private community tucked against the mountains outside Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I drove back to the hospital 2 days later when the call came that my father had taken a sharp turn. The private community roads were empty in the early morning dark, and I kept both hands on the wheel, breathing through the pressure that had built in my chest since the night I watched the security footage. Thomas and Guyenne met me at the ICU doors. He looked tired in the way people look when they have seen too many families fracture under the same fluorescent lights. "Your father is lucid for short windows," he said quietly. "The doctors are not giving timelines anymore. If there is anything you need to say to him, now is the time." My mother and my sister were already in the small private room. My mother stood at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed, the same posture she used when she wanted a conversation to end on her terms. My sister sat in the chair closest to the monitors, scrolling on her phone until she saw me. The air in the room felt thick with everything that had not been said out loud for years. My mother spoke first. "Natalie, the doctors need one more signature on the updated directive. Marcus Hale has it ready. Sign it and we can focus on keeping your father comfortable instead of turning this into another investigation." I did not sit. I stayed near the door with my bag over my shoulder, the folder of documents inside it heavier than it had any right to be. I signed the medical consent 2 nights ago. I am not signing anything that touches the trust or the estate until I have answers that make sense. My sister set her phone down hard enough that the sound carried. "You are doing this now, while Dad is literally fighting for every breath. This is not about money anymore. This is about whether you care more about old paperwork than about letting him go in peace." My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice so it would not reach the nurses in the hallway. "You have always needed to be right more than you needed to be part of this family. Your grandmother's trust was never meant to be a weapon you could swing at us when things got difficult. We used what was necessary to keep the life we built here. That life paid for your education, your wedding, the roof over your head. You act like we stole something that belonged only to you." I felt the old familiar sting, the one that had kept me quiet for so long. But the folder in my bag and the footage I had watched with Thomas would not let it silence me completely. I pulled out the printed timeline and the notes from the insurance discrepancies. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed the pages on the small table beside my father's bed. "These are not opinions," I said. "These are hospital records and bank transfers, the claims that paid out for treatments that never happened, the money that left the trust under signatures that match yours. I have the security footage of you and Courtney meeting with Marcus Hale to move it. I am not asking for an apology. I am telling you that I will not keep signing documents that let this continue." My mother's face did not change. She had spent too many years controlling rooms like this one. "If you take this outside this family, you will destroy what is left of your father's name in this community. People here respect the Brooks family because we have always handled our affairs privately and with dignity. You are choosing to turn a private matter into public gossip at the exact moment your father needs us united. That is not strength. That is selfishness, dressed up as principle." My sister stood up. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady in the way people sound when they have already decided who the villain is. "Dad built something here. The house, the standing, the connections that let Kevin's firm keep its clients. If you leak files or footage or whatever you think you have, it does not just hurt Mom. It hurts all of us. It hurts you. Think about what you are actually willing to lose before you decide to burn everything down. I looked at both of them and then at my father. He was awake, eyes open, breathing through the oxygen mask. He had heard enough. His hand moved slightly on the blanket, a small gesture toward me. I stepped closer and took it. His grip was weak but present. He spoke in short, careful sentences between breaths. "Natalie, I knew about some of it, not all the details. Your mother said it was to protect what we had built. The community here, it runs on reputation. I told myself it was temporary, that we would make it right later. I was wrong. I let it go on because the name mattered more than I admitted." He paused, eyes closing for a moment before opening again. "I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you not to spend my last days watching this family tear itself apart in public. Let the lawyers handle the money. Let your mother keep what is left of the story she needs. You do not have to win this to be free of it." The words landed with a finality that no argument could override. My father, the man whose name had been used to justify the quiet thefts, was asking me to choose peace for him over justice for myself. I felt the full weight of the choice settle in my chest. Continuing the fight meant dragging his final hours through depositions and community whispers and the kind of scandal that would follow his name long after he was gone. Stopping meant letting my mother keep control of the remaining assets and the narrative. It meant the evidence I had gathered would stay in a folder instead of becoming a weapon. I made the painful choice in that moment. I squeezed his hand once and nodded. "I will sign the medical directive. I will not pursue the trust or the insurance claims while you are here. After that, I decide what I do with what I know." My mother's shoulders relaxed by a fraction. My sister sat back down. Neither of them thanked me. They did not need to. The victory was already theirs in the way the room settled back into their version of order. My father died 2 days later. The service was small and private, exactly as my mother arranged it. The community association sent flowers. People who had known the Brooks family for years spoke in low voices about how difficult it must have been for Diane to manage everything during her husband's illness. No one mentioned the discrepancies in the records. No one asked why I stood slightly apart from my mother and sister during the graveside portion. In the weeks that followed, the consequences arrived without drama. Kevin came home one evening and told me he had been offered a position with a firm in another state. He said the move would be good for both of us, a fresh start away from the tension. When I asked if he wanted me to come, he looked at the floor and said he thought we needed space first. The marriage did not end in a fight. It ended in the quiet recognition that he could not stay married to someone whose questions had already started costing him clients and invitations in the only community he had ever wanted to belong to, Jenna Walsh. The neighbor I had considered a friend stopped returning my texts after the service. When I saw her at the small market in town, she smiled the polite smile people use when they have already chosen a side. My mother had made it clear in the circles that mattered that I had been difficult during a family crisis, that I had questioned things that did not need questioning while my father was dying. The story spread in the careful, bloodless way reputation travels in a place where everyone's house is set far enough apart that no one has to say anything directly. Thomas Nguyen called once after the funeral to ask how I was. I told him I was fine. He did not push. Marcus Hale sent a formal letter stating that all further trust and estate matters would be handled exclusively through my mother's counsel. I did not respond. I stayed in the house in the private community for 3 more months. I packed my clothes methodically the way I had always done everything. I left the folder of documents in a safe deposit box at a bank 2 towns over. I did not leak the footage. I did not file the claims. I chose the version of peace my father had asked for, even though it cost me the inner circle I had once believed was permanent. On the day I signed the papers to sell the house, I sat at the kitchen island one last time. The mountains were visible through the window, the same view that had made the community feel like a sanctuary when Kevin and I first moved in. I thought about the woman I had been at 33, the one who had driven to the hospital believing that clarity would be enough. She'd been right about the numbers. She had been wrong about how much the truth would be allowed to cost. I walked away with nothing but the knowledge that I no longer had to perform loyalty for people who had treated my questions as betrayal. The loss was real. The marriage, the friendships, the standing in the place I had called home, all of it gone. But the choice had been mine to make, and I had made it without asking permission or offering explanations that would never be accepted. Loyalty is not obligation. I learned that in a hospital room while my father took his last breaths and my mother and sister watched me decide how much of myself I was still willing to surrender. I chose to surrender less than they wanted and more than I had planned. That middle ground is where I live now. It is quieter than I expected. It is also mine. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping the truth, where do you draw the line?